Hello and welcome to the CUFI Weekly. I'm your host, Kasim Hafiz. So this week's topic, I kind of went back and forth about whether I should discuss it or not. One, it happened almost a week ago. And two, I don't want to give more attention to people who seem to just thrive over attention, negative or not. But I thought it was an important topic that we had to touch on. And that was the recent discussion about Iron Dome funding, which happened in the US Congress. So if you're not aware about what happened, I'll give you a brief overview. So there was a bill that was going to be discussed and voted on, which had provisions for funding for Israel's Iron Dome system. What is Iron Dome, you may ask? Iron Dome is Israel's anti-missile system, which has prevented the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Israel's enemies, which surround it, periodically fire rockets and missiles at Israeli civilian populations, trying to create the maximum amount of damage and carnage. Just in May, Hamas launched a war on Israel and fired hundreds of rockets. In response, Israel's Iron Dome system shot down so many and was able to prevent many civilian deaths. So this was what this was about. The US was going to provide funding to replace those systems which had been fired to protect Israeli civilians. But some Democrats objected to this, so that provision was removed from the bill. The next day, House Democrats introduced a new bill, which was a standalone bill to make sure that Israel got the funding it needed. Overwhelmingly, it passed by 420 to 9. What does that tell me? It tells me that still the United States stands with Israel. The United States stands with its ally. 9 voted against. Now, I know I don't need to go into any sort of discussion about who those 9 were, because it's the same old gang. It's the same people who seem to focus more obsessively about Israel and the Jewish state than they do about the districts that they were voted to represent. So I'm not going to give them attention and go through their names. You can look that up yourself. And while this victory was overwhelming, 420 to 9, it raises some very interesting questions for me that I'd be remiss if I did not touch on. Like I mentioned earlier, Iron Dome is a defensive system. This is a system whose sole purpose is to track rockets being fired at Israel and to shoot them out of the sky if they are going to hit civilian populations. This device has saved thousands of lives. And Israel saw that in full force in May's conflict. And this is what this was about. Funding Iron Dome, making sure Israel had the ability to protect its civilians. When Hamas fire rockets, they're not going for military targets, they're not going for infrastructure, they are firing them indiscriminately, and they are trying to cause the maximum amount of death, destruction, and carnage. In the last conflict, children died. Yet 9 members of Congress believed that this was something they wanted to vote against. The idea of giving Israel the ability to protect its civilians from terrorism, they said no to. And to quote Senator Tim Scott, the people who voted against, you are wrong, dead wrong. And that's the thing. You would rather see dead Israelis by the thousands than say yes to supporting our ally, saying yes to giving Israel the means to defend its civilians against indiscriminate attacks and terrorism. It's frankly horrific that members of Congress are supporting terrorists rather than a friend and a democracy. Because that's essentially what this is. It's between right and wrong. This isn't about policy or politics or anything like that. Genuinely. This isn't about human rights. This isn't about the Palestinians. This isn't about justice. This isn't about any of that. It's a simple bill saying that Israel should be supported in defending its citizens against terrorism. That when rockets are fired at Israel, it has the means to prevent those rockets hitting schools, kindergartens, hospitals. But 9 members of Congress said, no. We need to explain what Iron Dome is. We need to explain why Iron Dome exists. It exists because Israelis have had to deal with terror since their very birth. Every time they've taken a step against terror, their enemies, instead of looking for peace, looking for a better tomorrow, have found other ways to murder Israelis, rockets being one of the most recent ones. We have a responsibility to our country, we have a responsibility to ourselves, and we have a responsibility to future generations to ensure that they know the truth and they stand with Israel. The Bible clearly states you have not been given the spirit of fear. You have nothing to fear. So be bold and speak the truth. And for Zion's sake, do not remain silent.
Thanks for checking out today's episode of CUFI Weekly. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date with the latest news from the Middle East along with topics involving US-Israel relations, please be sure to like and subscribe. And remember to click that notification button so that you are notified every time a new show is uploaded.